Spencer, it's great to have you here. I want to talk about your books, but before we go there, I have kind of a personal question I want to ask you about.
Sure.
Now, your father, Andrew Klavan, is a brilliant, one of the best known American novelists, especially in, of course, mystery and crime stories. I happen to think that his podcast is the best one out there. I admire that show very much, and actually, that's how I was introduced to you. And one of the great things about your collaboration with your father, and this is what I want to ask you about as a father myself, because I have a 20-year-old son. You and your father have a very beautiful and sophisticated relationship. And frankly, I envy it very much. And so I'm interested to know how you and your father have been able to sort of work out and sort of transcend this sort of chasm between father son, but you still have retained that father and son relationship. But it's obviously you're very close, but there's a mutual respect. How are you and your father able to achieve that? It really is a wonderful thing to experience.
Oh, well, thank you. And it's one of the chief joys of my life. So it's actually a great blessing. I always start here by saying that we're very lucky, my dad and I, in that I think all fathers and sons naturally tend to love each other or to care very deeply for each other. Of course, there are tragic situations in which that relationship can be broken, but there's a natural, even I would almost call it an animal bond, not in a pejorative way, just that this is
Right.
an affection that grows automatically out of biological relationship.
Hmm.
But then, as you indicate, we're also friends, and one is lucky in one's life if one has few very, very close friends. And if one of those very close friends happens to be your father, then you've really won the lottery because it's
Hmm.
like layering over another relationship, another kind of love onto that original familial love.
Hmm.
And I will say that although we have not had a turbulent relationship, that the transition from father son to friendship was a dynamic one. That it mostly had to do with my own growing into maturity, and I think every father son pairing has the painful experience of realizing that in order to grow, you have to break away, and that's painful for both the parent and the child. You know, you become your own person, your own man, and that did happen to me sort of as I went through my teenage years. And so I guess my advice, if I have any, to fathers and sons that are in this kind of journey, trying to learn how to relate to one another as adults, I would say, that for the father, it's probably a process of letting go, that this is about coming to understand that this person you've known as dependent on you is going to now strike out on his own. The Bible speaks of children as arrows in a quiver, and
Hmm.
often this is taken to mean that your children are your wealth, or your children are part of your kind of arsenal, and all of that can be true. But there's a reason that the Bible doesn't speak of children as swords in your hand, because your children have a trajectory and arrows fly away from you, and that's proper and right. So you have to kind of learn on both sides to handle that and accept that, and then turn back toward one another. And on the son's part, I think there's an important lesson to be learned, which is that you are independent now, which means
Hmm.
that you are free. And whereas previously you were kind of obligated to your father, now it's up to you to freely choose to love and honor your
Hmm.
father, which is man's estate, to be able to make those free choices. And so,
Hmm.
just like the freedom that God gives us to live our lives as we choose, there's a purpose to that freedom, which is to choose the good. You will actually be destroyed by going off in sort of on dark paths, and God is not sort of scolding you or trying to ruin your fun by teaching you about virtue. He's inviting you into the dance of love, of freely chosen love. And this is the
Hmm.
same with fathers and sons, I think. So
Yeah.
it's a process that you have to learn to kind of accept step by step, but it's
Yeah.
obviously also the stuff of life.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like that relationship and your approach to it, and also your father's, Andrew Klavan, no relation. is this faith, and that faith is also present in your writing. Your books, just we don't know each other, but just so you know, I'm a lawyer by trade, but my undergraduate degree was I did an honors thesis in Shakespeare, and I read probably 2 to 3 books a week. And your 2 books are probably the most beautifully written prose I've seen in a long time. And you really treat beautifully in your most recent book this concept of the tension between science and religion. And this is not an easy topic, as you know. But I was reminded of a quotation here from Georges Lemaitre, who said, "There's no conflict between science and religion." And perhaps we could start there, because I think maybe that seems to be one of the main themes in your book that's different from some of the other books written on this topic, is you don't seem to see science and religion at war. In fact, you see them as sort of moving in harmony. Do I have this right? Tell me what you think about this in terms of your how you framed your second book.
Oh, well, thank you, first of all. And I think that you're onto something, which has to do, interestingly, with my particular place in my particular age and the time in which I grew up, and the fact that I am part of kind of an up and coming generation, as you mentioned. And I think the purpose of this new book, Light of the Mind, which what really makes it distinctive in this field, is that I really start out by announcing this attitude is out of date. This is an attitude that once seemed very prevalent, but now can be kind of swept away. And it can be swept away both from a scientific perspective, because science itself is now moving in a direction that seems to need a spiritual or religious outlook to make
Right.
sense out of it.
Mhm.
But also, it can be swept away from a religious perspective, because those of us that believe don't have anything to fear from science. And I think that, yeah, getting a handle on that, taking stock of that, and really realizing that that is where we're starting now, is a step down a new road that those of us that grew up with this idea of the war between science and religion, it might seem a bit strange at first. The subtitle of the book is Illuminating Science Through Faith, which would have sounded very provocative 10 years ago. But now that the new atheism has kind of passed away, a lot of people are starting to realize that you need some kind of supernatural or transcendent or metaphysical way of looking at the world to make sense of it. And so I think that, yeah, it is absolutely perhaps the quality of the writing that you're describing arises out of that delight, that there's actually nothing to fear here, that we actually have new discoveries to make about what we already know, that can now be incorporated into a more confident vision of the world that includes science and faith and endorses them both.
Mhm. One of the things I really appreciate about this book is you really don't skimp on the science. It's obvious that you spend a lot of time, even though you're trained as a classicist and obviously have a deep understanding of literature. You spend a lot of time getting into the guts of science and really studying not only the history of science, but the new science, how it ties into threads like atheism. What was that process like in researching that part of the book? Because it seems to me, I don't know if you have a scientific background, but it doesn't seem that you do. Was that a challenge, or was that an exciting thing for you to go off and do that research in sort of quote unquote hard science and dealing with some of the writings of people like Dr. Meyer?
Yeah, well, it was both, I would say. It was daunting and it was also exciting. I don't have a background beyond the college level in the sciences. My graduate work, as you indicate, was all in literature.
Hmm.
But we are really entering into an age, I've been calling it the age of the generalist. We're really entering into an age where we need to be talking to one another. And those of us who specialize in one field need to take other fields seriously. And it's urgent, because if Christians and scholars of literature abandon these fields to people who are totally uninterested in this matters of spiritual import, then we will be putting ourselves at this enormous disadvantage that other essentially atheists are the only ones who know about the physical world. Um, and I don't really think that's necessary at all. I hope this book is very readable. I hope it's
It is.
engaging.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, obviously it's working. I want to talk about your first book, How to Save the West: Ancient
Mm,
Wisdom for Five Modern Crises. And for those, if you've not read this yet, I experienced this first as an audiobook before I bought the hardcover. And you did a brilliant job of narration. Obviously, you have a splendid voice for narration. But this book, I found fascinating. It's more of a philosophy book,
mhm.
although that maybe understates the case. But I almost read this one when I read the second one, not as sort of a sequel, the second one being a sequel, but they do sort of fit together, don't they? Was that by design, or is that just how it worked out? Because the first book is really talking about it's described here as a book to let you know you're not alone. The wisdom of the ages can guide us through the struggles of the present. The fate of our civilization depends on whether ordinary people internalize the truth and beauty conveyed in the masterpieces of Western culture. And I really see a lot of the things that you talk about in that book, like the crisis of reality, the crisis of the body, the crisis of meaning, crisis of religion. All these things really, in a lot of ways, are further explicated in your second book. Do you agree with that, first of all? And was that by design?
Yes, that's very astute. I think you're the second person to notice this. So it's interesting because I've been talking about this book, obviously, a fair bit since it came out last week. And to me, this is almost a sequel to How to Save the West, which is funny to say because they don't bear any immediately obvious relationship. And it's not as if I set out to write two books that would follow one after the other. It's more that every book is also a thought process. And
Right.
if you're doing your job right, you're also learning things and you're discovering things, and you will usually end up, and this has been true also of the second book, you will usually end up feeling as if there's a whole other unwritten book contained in the book that you just wrote. And so what happened with How to Save the West is that I outlined that book in terms of five crises that I think we are facing. And I sort of I outlined it in advance, the five things that I think we're struggling with in the West at a deep philosophical level. So they are reality, our relationship to our bodies, um, meaning, religion, and politics, and those are the five crises. But as I began to work them out, it became really clear to me that they're each linked to one another, and that all of them lead up to the crisis of religion. That
Right.
ultimately behind each of them there is a problem that we're facing about whether we can believe in anything absolute beyond the material world.
Hmm.
Uh, and so it was for that reason that, in the crisis of religion section, I ended up talking about the multiverse and dealing with all these sort of scientific issues that I did not expect to be dealing with. And when a book surprises you, that's the best thing. That's when you're really on to something exciting. And I thought, this is really the obstacle. This is what's keeping us from biting the bullet, is our sense, not our intellectual idea, but more our superstition or our ambient fear that on the other side of the leap of faith, there is irrationality and a kind of anti-science outlook. And
Right.
so, yes, that this book came right out of that feeling, and right out of an attempt to address what I think is kind of the core crisis, and remove one of the major burdens that seems to be keeping people back from a healthy outlook on religion and so much else.
Hmm. Hmm.